understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is time for the podcast. And today we are coming from a very festive, a very commercial, I suspect, but really, and very chilly, but very Christmassy New York City.
Buying my presents, I hope.
John, buying you loads of presents, sunshine. Loads of presents. I saw the lights go on in Rockefeller Center last night. I was down in Bryant Park where there's a little ice skating rink and all the Yanks are going around. And they really do Christmas very, very well. It's completely over the top. And it's entirely driven. It's entirely driven
that's
by
what Christmas should be.
Sell.
Should be over the top. Yeah.
But they do it extremely well. I'm here for a couple of days. Just did an event. I also, John, I was in Grand Central Station last night. There's a place called the Oyster Bar. And I'm sitting there at the bar and a guy comes up to me, Irish guy, young guy, and just taps me on the shoulder, says, "Hi, how are you? You got to bring the podcast to New York." So that's it.
Yes.
In the new year.
Let's do that. So that's Australia, New York. God.
We're just going on the road. We're going on a trip.
Excellent.
But I want this podcast, we finished the last podcast with Russell Napier talking about money, global money, the change in what's going on. I want to continue along the broad vein of money, the broad vein of New York. But before we do this, when I was sitting in Bryant Park, John, last night, and I was watching the skaters skate around, and it was chilly, and I could smell the chestnuts roasting. And I was remembering that you, when a kid, were very fond of a certain movie about Christmas in America. And it was only a hop, skip, and jump from 34th Street. It was The Miracle. Do you remember that one, Johnny boy?
The Miracle of 34th Street. Love it. Love it. There's been several versions of that. And back in 1947, there was a great version. And then there was the full-on schmaltz version of 1994. Unbelievably schmaltz. But it's brilliant. With Richard Attenborough in it.
That is the one we want to quote from, John. Listen to this quote. We're going to talk about money. Bitcoin is at 100,000 today. We're going to talk about money in all its various incarnations. Have a listen to this.
The young lady who just approached the bench presented me with this Christmas card and this. It's a $1 bill. It's going to be returned to her shortly. But by presenting me with this bill, she reminded me of the fact that it's issued by the Treasury of the United States of America. And it's backed by the government and the people of the United States of America. Upon inspection of the article, you will see the words, "In God we trust." And we're not here to prove that God exists, but we are here to prove that a being just as invisible and yet just as present exists. Federal government puts its trust in God. It does so on faith, and faith alone. It's the will of the people that guides the government. And it is and was their collective faith in a greater being that gave and gives cause to the inscription on this bill. Now, if the government of the United States can issue its currency bearing a declaration of trust in God without demanding physical evidence of the existence or the non-existence of a greater being, then the state of New York, by a similar demonstration of the collective faith of its people, can accept and acknowledge that Santa Claus does exist, and he exists in the person of Bruce Springsteen.
So Santa exists? Santa exists,
John. Santa exists, John, because the people will it to exist. But this brings us to money. And what I want to talk to you about today. I'm sitting here. Bitcoin is at $100,000. It has broken the $100,000. There's no greater MAGA signal than Bitcoin breaking the $100,000. Bitcoin is, I've said, many, many things, but it's not money. And the reason it's not money is based around what that quote was saying, which is it's the institutions and the people and the demography that have their faith in something like the dollar. And that is what gives us its strength. When the people decide to abandon the dollar, if they ever do, and put their faith into something else, then that something else could well become something like money. But right now, what you have is Bitcoin, which I've always felt, John, is more like a lobby group than anything else,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the lobby group is driven by the whales who own it, and not just Bitcoin, but I mean crypto in general, because there's a huge amount of it. Here in New York, there's a huge amount of stuff on TV and on podcasts, on the airwaves about crypto in general. Crypto in general is a lobby group, and Bitcoin is a particularly interesting lobby group because this all started out, you might remember, in 2007, when the faith in the financial system had been destroyed by the 2007, 2008 crash. What you had was people yearning a different form of money, something that couldn't be corrupted by the state, by the banking system, by Wall Street. So
By
Bitcoin
Sam
starts.
Bankman-Fried.
Just wait till he's pardoned by Donald Trump, by the way.
Oh, Jesus.
That's one to watch. Oh, yeah, because Trump is in this bizarre situation that Trump has said he wants to make America the Bitcoin capital of the world.
Hmm.
But somebody's going to tap on the shoulder and say, listen, Donald, your real strength comes from the dollar. And if Bitcoin is an anti-dollar movement, then you have a problem. Because what gives America its great strength is it issues the reserve currency. And by issuing the reserve currency, it sets the global rate of interest on its bonds. And by doing that, it can actually in some way begin to exercise its power around the world. A waning power, but a power nonetheless.
So do you think that Bitcoin then, I mean, a lot of people have made a lot of money out of Bitcoin, but is Bitcoin in a full-on tulip phase at the moment? Or is there something more to it?
I think what there is now, just think what's happening, right? What is actually happening that explains this situation. Bitcoin is up about 40% since Trump got elected.
Yeah.
Now, come back to my idea that this is a lobby group. If the perception is that the lobby group is going to be successful, then the price goes up. Now, what is that? Because nothing has happened to the dollar, nothing has happened to interest rates, nothing has happened to the long bond rate, nothing has happened to the rate of inflation to make Bitcoin go up. So what's pushing it up? It's pushing up is the idea that the lobby group is going to be successful. Now, what is the lobby group? The lobby group are holders of Bitcoin and holders of crypto that invested and put millions into the Trump campaign, millions and millions into the Trump campaign, in order for the new Treasury Secretary of the United States to include Bitcoin as a normal asset, and therefore to sell Bitcoin down through 401ks, through people's actual pension funds. Now, what that does, therefore, it disseminates widely Bitcoin as an asset, but more importantly, it constitutes the Wall Streetization of Bitcoin. Because the banks who are going to sell Bitcoin to the punters are the very Wall Street banks that Bitcoin was set up against after the financial crash. So what you have is a digital asset which masqueraded as and marketed itself as the anti-establishment fuck you currency based on Armageddon, that the world is going to end and these evil bankers and states are all going to collapse and we are going to be the last man standing. We are going to be like the Mad Max of finance. It has gone from the Mad Max of finance to the pinstriped suit of the city and to the Brooks Brothers suit of Wall Street. Why? Because it's those salesmen that will be marketing Bitcoin to the punters after Trump creates his new treasury team, all of whom are MAGA inflected and all of whom are pro-crypto.
So if people buy into this, and especially if they start investing through their 401ks or whatever, then it will hit a critical mass and then it'll become more accepted and therefore is more likely to become a more usable currency or usable thing.
Yeah, very interesting points, John. The only way Bitcoin can be usable is if the dollar becomes unusable.
Right.
So you have to make a massive bet against the dollar to support the proposition that Bitcoin is money. This is number one. Number two, you put your finger on it when you talked about tulips. The whole point of tulip mania was hoarding the tulips, hoarding the bulbs in order to sell on.
Yeah.
So again, what's happening in Bitcoin, you have this thing called HODL, hold on for dear life.
Yeah.
Anybody who understands money in any of its guises knows that what actually makes money interesting is using money, not hoarding money. So this is the very antithesis of money. But it is a digital asset that's going up. But what I think is more concerning is the following, that as Bitcoin becomes marketed by Wall Street will also create, because banks do this all the time, will create ways on which you can borrow in order to buy Bitcoin in the same way as you would borrow for property. Then Bitcoin becomes leveraged to the average income of the average individual. And then you're in a terrifying situation where a digital asset with no income, with no stream of income ever, with no rate of interest, a digital asset that is going up and something that's going up all the time will debar people from borrowing in it, because if you borrow in an asset that's going up all the time, you have to pay back more of your real income, which is your labor, to pay it back. So I think this is the dangerous thing. At the moment, as you said, I bought Bitcoin a while again. I'm along for the ride because it's a bit of fun. But when you start to look at it, it has all the feelings, right? If an asset goes from, let's say, $50,000 to $100,000 in 3 weeks, based on a change in regulation, not based on anything fundamental, then you've got to worry about where this thing all goes. But right at the moment, MAGA is in a celebratory mood. It's increased my little bit of income by 50%. So that's kind of funny. But for the society in general, what you have to do in order for Bitcoin to be the future of money is you are making a bet on apocalypse. You are making a bet on exactly the stuff you saw there in the Miracle of 34th thing. You're making a bet that that all evaporates, that there is no institution, there is no will of the people, there is no democracy. There basically is, in effect, a Armageddonist future where fellas in Montana with shotguns, cans of beans, tinned meats, and Bitcoin are the future.
I know a few of them, all right.
But it's fascinating to be here at the time, right?
But hang on a second, Mark. One of the other things I heard Trump say, I mean, he did actually call Bitcoin a scam not that long ago, actually. But talking about the dollar and as the reserve currency, he was also threatening the BRICS nations because they want to de-dollarize. He was threatening them with tariffs, more and more tariffs. So he is worried about the dollar as well then.
American patriots believe in the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, the Air Force, and the dollar. That is what they believe in. Trump is an American patriot.
Yeah.
But the reason Trump became a Bitcoiner is because there was a massive constituency in there. Millions and millions of potential voters use crypto and have bought little bits of crypto. And the brilliant thing about Trump is his ability, or his ability during the election, to isolate various different groups and promise those various different groups everything. And he isolated the Bitcoiners and he promised them everything so that they'd vote for him. But the way he's talking to the BRICS and everybody else, he's talking like an old style American president, which is, if you want to undermine the dollar, you are undermining the very, very essence of American financial, commercial, and thus political strength. And we will not have that. And we will not in any way encourage that. And we will do everything in our power to actually punish you for doing that. So what you have is Trump is speaking 2 or 3 languages. As they'd say in Ireland, he's speaking out of not only both sides of his mouth, 3 sides of his mouth on this issue.
And his hole as well.
And his Swiss roll, exactly. But be that as it may, it is an extraordinary thing that a digital asset that has no actual use has doubled in value because its owners, largely the whales. I mean, the thing about Bitcoin is there's 2 types of owners. There's the very rich and the very poor, right? The very rich are the whales who own huge positions in this and are immensely rich and getting richer by the day. The other side of the coin are the very poor. Because Bitcoin is all about hope value, it's like buying a lottery ticket. Like you hope to God it's just going to go up. So what you have is this unholy alliance of the very rich and the very poor pushing up an asset that is designed to undermine the dollar, which is the very power base that Trump actually understands and Americans understand. At some stage, the immovable object, which is the dollar, and the irresistible force, which is the upward ascendancy of Bitcoin, will smash into each other. And I suspect that's the way we're going. Now, if that happens at a time when Wall Street has got its grubby hands into Bitcoin and has leveraged people into buying Bitcoin, that's when you have a problem, because the fall of Bitcoin then will prompt what's called margin calls, where the people who bought Bitcoin on leverage have to come with real goods, real dollars to pay off their margin. And that, I think, is the next phase in this discussion. And that's the next phase. And that's where you will find the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, involving themselves in a trade which will ultimately undermine themselves. It's that old adage, John, about financial engineering, right?
What's that?
Financial engineering, which is, allowing various different bits of finance to do their thing, right? Financial engineering is the only type of engineering that makes the system less stable, not more stable. So imagine a proper engineer who builds these buildings around here, right?
Yeah.
Every time there's an increase in proper engineering, buildings become more safe. Every time there's an increase in financial engineering, the system becomes less safe. That is the rule of the last 30 years. And that's what we're looking at now, which is kind of extraordinary. But it's wonderful to be here because of the essence of the city, John, because of the vibrancy, the dynamism, the energy, the madness, all that sort of stuff. You can kind of feel the economy on the street here. And that's what I love about it.
Well, New York is absolutely unique. Yeah, haven't been there in a while, but I love it.
Well, I'll tell you what we're going to do, John. In the second half, we're going to talk about what makes New York unique. What happened in economic history, in diversity, in demographics, in money, in the density with which people live here. How did that all come together to make this city the bizarre, magical place that it is? So let's talk about this after the break.
So, Mac, you're over in New York, Christmas shopping, I assume, for me.
Actually, do you know we did our 100th podcast of the year yesterday?
So I believe, and past the 500 episode mark as well.
It's pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive. It's a lot of output.
Absolutely. And also, Mac, I see that the book got reviewed by the IMF. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know, John. That's a really good question. But it is quite amazing when the IMF reviews a book about money and says things like, skillful conversational storyteller, unpacking money's joy and horrors. I think the best one he just said, Dave McWilliams' surprisingly memorable joyride through 5,000 years, from early coins to crypto. I love that. Surprisingly memorable. I don't know if it was surprisingly memorable because I wrote it or surprisingly memorable because the actual journey is interesting. No, it was a really nice review by the IMF, which is brilliant, because you want the IMF to be writing this stuff and reading the book. So that's wonderful. And again, I'm over here for a number of reasons. The other one is it's going to be published here in the States in 2025. So I'm talking to the publishers, etc. And of course, it's a completely different feel. When you the idea of publishing in the States is so big, and there's so many shows you go on, etc. But you'd find this interesting, John, talking to the publicists and talking to people in PR here in New York about how you market books or whatever. They're all saying podcasts, 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 podcasts.
Right.
So I will be pimping my arse around every podcast.
Good man. Good man. Excellent.
It'll be shameless. Shameless.
So go on, tell us about New York. What have you learned this time?
Well, what I want to talk to you about is, it's funny we started talking about money there, John. There was an extraordinary currency here called wampum, WAMPUM. And the reason I know about this because I was reading about it in the book, but it came back to me yesterday when I was up in Spanish Harlem at a wonderful museum. If you get to New York, a museum that is well worth going to. It's a little bit off the beaten track, is the Museum of the City of New York. And it's
Right.
basically for economic history nerds like myself in the main. Like, what made New York? What is the history of the place? And it starts, of course, with the first Dutch settlers coming in here in the early 16th century, realizing this had an incredibly deep water port, number one. Number two, that the Hudson River connected it about 300 miles upriver with all sorts of tribes that were living in and around the area. And the tribes living in and around the area created the first industry of New York, which is, of course, furs, because that's what the
Yeah.
Europeans wanted. And then, of
Mm.
course, you had this idea, well, what did you trade with? The Europeans came with coins, Dutch guilders,
Yeah.
which were minted in Holland. And the American Indians, the Native Americans, looked at this stuff and said, I don't want little pieces of coin. That's not of any value to me. So the Europeans had to come up with a currency that was of sufficient value to the Native Americans so that the Native Americans would trade with them. And this is before Europeans went on the full Holocaust, let's exterminate these people. This is when the Europeans were very small in number, the natives were enormous in number, and they wanted to trade together. And of course, the Dutch were the first tradespeople here, which is why the place was called New Amsterdam,
Yes. Yeah.
And so they found out that what the Native Americans were using as currency was a thing called wampum. And that's a shell bead. Includes white shell beads of whelks and purple beads made from hard-shelled clams. So this was basically, in effect, a gift that the Native Americans used to give to each other. It constituted status, etc.
Mm.
So the Europeans came in, they said, okay, well, why don't we adopt this wampum stuff as currency to trade with the native people here in New York and up the road in New England? And believe it or not, in New England in 1637, wampum, which was a bead, a shell, became
Yes.
legal tender in New England. So it
Wow.
constituted a currency in New England and here in New York until 1673. And it was at a rate of 8 wampum beads equal to 1 stiver. The stiver was a Dutch copper coin.
So did that spark beach combing? People going around picking up shells from the beach?
You're absolutely right. So again, now remember,
Wow.
Exactly right. So what happened was, of course, then the tribes further south in Virginia, they copped onto this and they started using it. So it was the currency of Virginia and New England, the legal tender. Legal tender means you can pay your taxes in this thing.
Yeah.
So you can pay your taxes with this wampum stuff, right? And again, it was in a bead. Now, fascinatingly, and this goes back to the difference in mentalities, right? Because, and remember we talked about Bitcoin being hoarded.
Yeah.
So wampum as a currency, right? The use of wampum as a currency dates from about 1622 here, where the Dutch started it, right? All the way up to about 1710. So 100 years. But phenomenally, and this is the difference, right? The Europeans quickly began to try hoarding vast quantities of the currency to get rich as we would do Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And all the time they hoarded, they start taking the currency out of circulation. And as the currency started to go out of circulation, it became much less useful.
Yeah.
So wampum's significance began to decline exactly at the time when the Europeans started to hoard it, right? Now, fascinatingly, the Native Americans couldn't get their heads around hoarding because they had no concept of wealth. They had no understanding of why would you hoard this stuff that's useful when we all want it and we can kind of wear it and show it off.
Yeah.
And it was the end of wampum was basically a clash of civilizations. You have the indigenous people who had no sense of acquiring assets to keep and hoard and pass on because they were living at one with and were part of nature. And you have the Europeans that got this stuff called wampum and rather than use it to trade, started to hoard it for its own intrinsic value. And at the end of the day, of course, it lost its value simply because they weren't trading. And then the final bit of all this is the European weakness for counterfeiting.
Right, yes, of course.
So wampum was made worthwhile for the Indians simply because it had a beautiful ornamental value for them. It had
Yeah,
status value. It was part of gifting, but it was also scarce because these
yeah.
clams and razor clam shells, they were scarce. The Dutch here in New Amsterdam perfected a way of counterfeiting wampum, of making synthetic wampum.
Plastic, was it?
Yeah, a pre-runner of plastic, and they
Yeah.
bloody well flooded the system. They descended into hyperinflation, and wampum ended. But the reason this story is interesting, John, it constitutes the first interaction between the local indigenous people and the Europeans at a
Yeah.
time when the Europeans were so few in number that they were prepared to trade. And the really fascinating thing was this is the first example in history, and I think ever, of colonists adopting native people's economic methodologies rather than the other way around.
Right,
And
yes.
that in itself is interesting. Of course, that was the case until more and more and more colonists came, and suddenly they swamped the locals. But it's a very interesting example. It also is an interesting example of how money resides in our imagination. How it is, in the same way as we started this, Miracle of 34th Street suggested money is an act of collective belief. That if you
Yes.
all believe in it, whether you're saying God or whether you're saying the dollar, if everybody believes in it, it works.
Yes.
And then wampum was the same thing. Everyone believed in it until, ironically, the Europeans started to hoard it. And then it lost its intrinsic value. And we move on. But that locates the beginning of New York in New Amsterdam. And of course, then the Dutch ended up getting beaten. The Dutch fought 3 successive colonial wars with the English. They got
Yeah.
beaten on 3 occasions. And of course, this place turned into New York and became the trading outpost of the English here in this area.
And what did they replace the wampum with then?
Well, they replaced the wampum with slavery. That's the really weird thing, because they only needed wampum as long as they were trading with the Native Americans for furs and timbers. They were the 2 big
Yeah.
things, right? Once loads and loads of European colonists arrive, they begin to kill the Native Americans. And then who do they use? They use black slaves to actually fell the forests. French and British trappers came to kill the animals for fur. And we begin the process of the monetization of North America. Ironically, the coin they used to use, John, here was the silver real, which was the Mexican coin. And the reason is that the colonists here in the United States had very, very little coins. They had to import coins from Britain, and Britain was going consistently through coin shortages because they had no access to big mines. Of course, the Spanish down in Latin America found enormous amounts of silver and gold, but particularly silver, and they minted a thing called the real. And the real was, in effect, the American currency up until the American Revolution, which is kind of
Right,
interesting
okay.
in and of itself. But if we
Yeah.
go back to here, basically, you have this extraordinary city that goes through a sort of a trading spurt, a colonial spurt, a manufacturing spurt, and then, of course, the big immigration of Irish and then Jews and then Italians and, all sorts of people after that. But fascinatingly, what made New York the immense city that it is, has been geography and the grid plan. So
Yeah.
New York is relatively small. Manhattan is just 23 square miles. So this required intense living of people on top of each other, right? In 1811, the commissioners of New York introduced the grid system that's so famous, right? The grid system of the avenues and the streets. This became the way in which New York was developed along plot lines. So you could buy a plot miles away up Manhattan where it was just green fields, but as long as it accorded to the grid system, you were buying a piece of real estate that eventually, as the city swelled up, and filled up with people would become valuable. So
Right.
if you think that cities are the places that all economic adventure comes from,
Yes.
and it's the absence of physical space between people makes the connections, makes the interactions, makes the codependencies, makes people say, sitting down in a cafe, could you imagine we doing this? Let's do that. It's the agglomeration of humans that makes the city the economic dynamo that it is. It's not necessarily, for example, finding minerals or finding coal or all those sort of things. They're secondary. What actually happens, as we know in our Schumpeterian worldview, John,
Yeah. Yeah.
that economics happens inside people's heads. The more people, the more heads, the more people chatting, the
Yeah.
more ideas, the more risk, etc. And then there's just one big, big change that happens in New York in about the 1820s, John, which is the opening of the Erie Canal. Because the Erie Canal joins New York with the hinterland of the Midwest and with the great waterways of Mississippi
Yeah.
and the Ohio River, through which the grain surpluses of the United States can arrive in New York and be exported to Europe. And this is the moment of economic, it's almost like a moment of nuclear fusion. This is the moment where it all kicks off.
Yeah.
And New York becomes the trading area for the United States. It's the main port. And it's to do with the Erie Canal. Of course, the Erie Canal was largely built by Irish people.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So the Erie
Yeah.
Canal is completed in 1825. It's 363 miles long, which is huge, right? And it connects basically the Hudson River to Lake Erie, and then from Lake Erie to the Midwest. This profoundly changes the whole geography of the world. Okay, I'll give you some statistics. By 1850, a quarter of all the grain grown in the United States made its way to Europe via the Erie Canal. That is phenomenal.
All right.
It was what was recorded as a grain shock in Europe. Cheap American grain profoundly depressed the price of wheat and other cereals in Europe. This is what led to mass immigration of Germans from Europe, German farmers. And it was the arrival of the German farmers prompted by the Erie Canal and the arrival of the Irish immigrants prompted by the famine that profoundly changed the nature of this city and led us to where we're going to conclude this episode, John, on nativism, because that really brings the MAGA movement into full historical focus. So the MAGA movement is white, nativist, anti-foreigner, and anti-foreign competition. If you actually look at its basic ideas, right? This all has its genesis in the nativist movement. We've talked about them before on the podcast of the 1850s, when Irish people in particular were arriving into New York at the rate of 4,000 a day. A day.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
A day in the 1840s, 1850s. We are the Mexicans of the 1850s. The
Yeah.
American establishment reacts as the American establishment is doing now with a MAGA movement called the Know Nothings, whose official title was the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, John. And it was a secret order based along the same lines as the Orange Order and, of course, prior to that, the Freemasons.
Yes.
And it was of
Yeah.
white
Yeah. Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon wasps, artisans in general, coopers, tanners, these sort of guys who saw their wages falling in the same way as Midwest American car workers have seen their wages falling. And they saw the cultural shift, which was our young girls are going to end up with these Irish fellas, and these are Catholics, and these are different. And of course, it all focused on the 5 Points area of New York, not very far from where I am now, which was
Yeah.
basically
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Sodom and Gomorrah. And there was all sorts of temperance movements and this sort of stuff. But to come back to Mr. Trump, John, because I know you want to end at Mr. Trump because you are fascinated by him. To come back to Mr. Trump, the MAGA movement is the direct, linear descendant of the Know Nothing movements that started here precipitated by a fear of the foul, nasty, mendacious, duplicit, culture warping Irish people. We started it all, John. It all starts with us.
And you're back to mix it up again.
And I'm back to annoy them again.